I'm going to show you how to use the most common hooks in React. I have this to-do app, and right now we have a fixed array of to-dos which is being displayed on the screen. But it doesn't change when we click on the checkboxes or when we try to add a new item to the list. Let's see what happens if we try to add a new item to this to-dos array. To do that, we can add an on-click handler to the Add New button. And we'll implement the Add New function. So what we'll do is we'll push a new element to the to-dos array. Let's say ID is the length of the to-dos array plus 1. The task is test task, and is complete will be false. But when I hit Add New, nothing happens. Let's think about why nothing happens. In order to render our app component to the screen, React calls this function, gets all this HTML, and then appends it to the root element here. But when we push a new element to the to-dos array, React doesn't call the app function again with the new to-dos, so the display is not updated. To change the value and also let React know that we've changed it, we have to use the useState hook. So if we import the useState hook and then call it, let's see what it returns by logging it to the screen. We see that useState returns an array with 2 elements. The first element here is undefined and the second element is a function. If instead of just calling useState, I pass it the to-dos, then the first element is the to-dos and the second element is a function. So the first element here is the state that we want to keep track of, and the second element is a function React provides to us to update the state. Usually the way you use useState is like this. What you're doing here is destructuring the 2 elements of the array into their own variables. So here to-dos is assigned to the first element of the array returned by useState, and set-to-dos is assigned to the second element of the array. Now to make our add new function work, instead of pushing to the to-dos array, we should use the provided set-to-dos function to modify the to-dos. Like this. Now if you add new items, you get this test task. That's because we've just provided a fixed value here, task, for the task name. Now let's try to use the value in this input element instead of this fixed string test task. To do that, we can use the useRef hook provided by React. Unlike the useState hook, the useRef hook only returns a single value. The useRef hook is similar to the useState hook in that it stores a value, but different in that it doesn't re-render the UI when the ref changes. The most common use of the useRef hook is to store an HTML element, which we can do like this. Now in our add new function, if we log the current value of the ref to the screen, then we get the input element. So in our add new function, instead of using this fixed string test task, we can use the current value of the input element. And now when we add a new element, it has the correct name. You'll notice we're getting this error. This is because we haven't yet implemented the onChange function on the to-do component. So let's implement onChange, and we'll assign it to a function, toggle complete, and we'll pass the to-do. And then let's implement this toggle complete function, and it'll accept a to-do item. So all we need to do here is return all the elements of the to-dos, whose ID is different from the one we passed, plus the to-do we passed, but we'll switch its complete value to true if it's false and false if it's true. Now this works, but the order of the to-dos changes every time we click something. To make it constant, one thing we can do is sort the to-dos alphabetically before we show them. And now the to-dos stay in order. Note that every time this component re-renders, we'll have to sort all the to-dos. This is fine in our case because the only time we re-render is when the to-dos changes. But sometimes you may want to avoid redoing this calculation on every render. To do that, React provides you with the useMemo hook. Let's import useMemo now. The useMemo hook accepts a function and a dependency array, and returns the value returned by that function. The useMemo hook will only recalculate the value from this function when any of the values in the dependency array change. Of course, in this case, it doesn't do anything because our component will only re-render when to-dos changes. Next, let's learn about the useId hook. You may have noticed a problem. When I click the first checkbox, it works great, but if I click the other checkboxes, they just control the first checkbox. To see why this is happening, let's look at our to-do item component. You see we have an HTML input element and an HTML label element. The way these work is you define an ID on the input element, and then you say HTML4 is equal to that ID. The problem we're having here is that all the to-dos have the same ID, so all the labels only end up working for the first checkbox. To change this, we need a unique ID for each to-do. We could try to generate our own unique label using the to-do's ID, but an easier way to do this is to use the useId function provided to us by React. This just provides us a unique ID for a component. And now it works. The next hook I want to look at is like useMemo, but instead of caching values, it caches functions, and it's called the useCallback hook. Right now, every time we re-render a component, the toggle complete function is recreated. This is fine, but if we were passing toggle complete to another component, that component would re-render too. To avoid this, React provides us with the useCallback hook. We use it like this. So similar to useMemo, we pass it a function and then a dependency array. But unlike useMemo, instead of returning the value of the function, we just return the function itself. But this hasn't really done anything, because the dependency array says to recreate the function every time toDo's changes, which is the only time our component will re-render. But we can fix this, because the setToDo's function accepts not only a value, but also a function. If instead of passing it this value which depends on toDo's, we pass it this function, then we can remove toDo's from the dependency array, and it does the same thing. Now, since the dependency array is empty, the toggle complete function will only be created once when the page first renders. The second last hook we're going to look at is one of the most important, and it's called the useEffect hook. The useEffect hook is different from the other hooks we looked at in that it doesn't return a value. Instead, it runs the function you provide it every time the dependency array changes. This is exactly the same as useMemo, except it doesn't give you the return value. So in theory, you could just use useMemo instead of useEffect. But that would be confusing, so I don't recommend you do that. The useEffect hook is described in the docs as being useful for synchronizing a component with an external system. In practice, often what you want to do is access web APIs like scrolling or focus, or fetch data from an external API. For example, if we want to focus on the input element for a new to-do when the page loads, we can do that with the useEffect hook with ref, current, focus. Now when we load the page, we'll automatically focus on this input element. Similar to useMemo and useCallback, the dependency array defines when the effect will rerun. With an empty dependency array, it will only run once when the page first loads. One of the most common uses of the useEffect hook is to fetch data from an external source. For example, right now we're just defining our initial to-dos as a fixed array. Instead of doing this, we can use the useEffect hook to fetch the initial to-dos from an API. I have this API which just returns some to-dos. Let's fetch from this URL. We need this function to be async, but useEffect can't accept an async function. So instead, we define an async function inside the useEffect. So this function will fetch data from the API, then get the JSON from it, and then set to-dos to that JSON. Now inside our useEffect, we'll just call the fetch data function. Now we don't need this fixed array for the initial to-dos. And if we reload the page, we'll see a small flicker as the data loads, and then we'll see all our to-dos. Right now, I forgot the dependency array. That means that every time the page re-renders, the useEffect will run. So if I click the checkbox, nothing happens. Since I only want to run this useEffect once, I'll give it an empty dependency array. And now it works. The final kind of hook we'll look at is not provided by React at all. Instead, it's custom hooks, which you define yourself to consolidate your logic and make your code cleaner. For example, we now have a lot of logic related to to-dos. We may want to reuse this logic in another part in our application. To avoid repeating ourselves, we can define a custom hook. To do that, let's create a function and call it useToDos. You can call it anything you want, but it's common to use the prefix use to indicate that it's a custom hook. And then let's copy all of our logic into this hook. Now we need to return the values that the component is using. Now in our app component, let's use the hook, like this. Now our code looks a lot cleaner because we've moved the to-dos logic to its own function. With that, we've covered all the most common hooks you're going to use in React over 90% of the time. And if you understand these ones, it won't be hard to understand all the other hooks that React provides. If you like this video, please leave a like and a comment, and subscribe to see more videos like this soon.